This is Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. The much-anticipated meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin took place on July 16th in Helsinki. During the summit, the leaders failed to discuss Russia's actions in Ukraine, and only Putin talked about Crimea. And many American politicians on both sides of the aisle, as well as their European colleagues, harshly criticized Trump's statements and behavior during his meeting with Putin. To talk more about the outcomes of this summit, we're joined in the studio today by Eugene Yaroshenko, international relations expert at the Democracy House think tank. Hello, thanks for joining us, Eugene.
Hello, thanks for inviting.
So first, let's talk about the fact that there were a lot of peculiarities, even in the beginning before this meeting happened.
Yeah, I would like to admit several peculiarities. First is that it was a very short period of time before an announcement of a possible US-Russia summit appeared, and that actually were only several weeks before it happened, in fact. As for relations between such great powers, it's unnaturally short period of time. Second peculiarity...
Before you go on, what's the usual period of time then, and what makes this so unusual?
Well, it takes months, sometimes it may take up to half a year, and an agenda that is likely to discuss is agreed in advance. But we did not see that there was any clear agenda before the summit itself started.
Yeah, usually people, either politicians, especially in the U.S., there's the opportunity for Congress or other members to be able to see what the agenda will be to help develop what should or should not be discussed in the U.S. policy. So there was no real opportunity to do this. People just had an idea. Syria may be discussed. Trump says he'll talk about Ukraine, but there's no set agenda.
Yes, and in turn, the lack of clear agenda resulted that in the run-up to the summit and during the summit, U.S. major partners and enemies, they had a feeling of fear and mistrust in the U.S. president because of
no one had any idea of what he's going to say.
Yeah, because of recent controversial statements addressed at the German leadership, because other not pleasant rumors about Trump's statements on Crimea, trade wars between US, Canada, European countries, China, etc.
Yeah, so unpredictability is definitely not something you want in this size meeting. What were some of the other peculiarities that you noted?
Another peculiarity is that both Putin and Trump considered this meeting as a very important summit. It's important as its image character, because usually leaders meet in order to sign some previously agreed documents. But here, both the Kremlin and the White House portrayed its meeting as a political advantage for both domestic audience and as an advantage for their respective countries on the international agenda, on the international arena.
So less about coming to agreements, signing statements, and more about an image, prestige kind of thing.
Yeah, for Vladimir Putin, it was important to have a bilateral meeting with U.S. president, and this meeting, from Russia's point of view, was necessary in order to demonstrate that the U.S. respect Russia's interest, and none of current global security issues can be resolved without Russia's participation. For the U.S. president, it was important, given upcoming U.S. provisional elections to the Congress, it was important for Trump to demonstrate that he at least tries to fulfill some of his electoral promises that he actually promised 2 years ago, and to demonstrate that he at least tries to find some common ground with Vladimir Putin.
And it doesn't seem that this worked out as well when we see with especially the press conference and what comes across. There are a lot of very important topics that weren't discussed. For example, specifically about Ukraine, and there was this promise, so a verbal promise by Trump, that this would be an important part of the discussion. But we could see during the press conference that there were key issues when we come to the Minsk Agreement, to Crimea, to MH17, that Trump failed to bring up.
Yeah, despite much anticipations in Ukraine, both leaders mostly did not mention any events in or around Ukraine. The only thing that they mentioned is that about the necessity of implementing the Minsk agreements. But other things, Crimea, MH17, sanctions, they were not discussed. At least they were not discussed before journalists. Probably it was part of behind-the-scene talks. But as we see the follow-up statement, Ukraine was on the very margins of this summit.
Well, it also seemed that more came out of Putin's mouth regarding this than Trump. It was Putin who said what Trump's position on Crimea was. And it was also, I think, said that it was Putin who said that, he's trying to push the U.S. to hold Ukraine to its side of the Minsk agreements. So it seemed that when it came to Ukraine and Crimea, it was more of this dismissal of it as the problems lie with Ukraine and not with any actions from Russia. Did you get a sense of what this could possibly mean without the discussion of Ukraine?
Trump tries to keep distance from Ukraine because he's often accused of his attempts to bridge gap with Russia, and that's why he tries to distance himself from sensitive topics, because he can lose many political support at home. He can lose trust of the European partners and allies. And another point why Ukraine was on the margins, it can be explained by the upcoming presidential parliamentary elections in Ukraine next year, and therefore both Moscow and Washington may decide to play a waiting game in order to see what the new government or the current government in case of re-election would look like.
Mm-hmm. And in general, would you say this meeting was productive?
I would say it was productive only in areas where both Washington and Moscow could have some chances to find common ground, when they have mutual interest and they realize the necessity that it is more beneficial to cooperate than to maintain rivals. One area where they are likely where they agreed and were likely to see further developments arising from this agreement is Syria. Mm-hmm. In particular, Russia is believed to agree that there should be no Iranian troops along the borders with Jordan and Israel. But on the other hand, the US recognized that Bashar al-Assad should retake the whole territory of Syria. And the second area where Putin and Trump may have agreed is about energy prices. I mean, both parties are likely, both parties have an interest to increase gas export to world market, and therefore they can have an interest in having more predictable energy prices in order to boost their own exports. And it is also an important point for many US allies, such as Saudi Arabia, who is heavily dependent on energy prices.
And do you think with Trump's statement about Nord Stream 2, and especially his attack on Germany, why did we not hear as much? I'm sure it seems to be a common thing with Trump to say something one place and to not mention it or say something different when faced directly with that situation. But do you believe Nord Stream 2 was something that was discussed or brought up?
Yes, I'm pretty sure Nord Stream 2 was discussed because the US consider Nord Stream 2 as a economic project that competes with US midterm interest, because US also wants to increase its share on European gas market and to attract more European consumers. But despite the energy competition over energy market, I believe Putin and Trump may have an agreement on this issue. For example, it's like Nord Stream 2 would be constructed in a few years, but in exchange of increase the US import in European countries.
Well, it will be interesting to see how that turns out. And on the other side is that Putin can act unilaterally, but whereas Trump has some limitations on his ability to make agreements and to enter into agreements without the approval of Congress. So what do you see coming next from this? Were there any actual progress made here if there may not be any agreements? This is all a verbal discussion.
Well, in foreign policy, Donald Trump has certain institutional restrictions by his circles, by Department of State, by National Security Advisor. It is especially relevant when it comes to relations with Ukraine and Russia. But when it comes to other issues like Israel, and other trade wars, here we can see more and more unpredictability from the American side. But actually, what we can, among further developments that we can see following this summit, is that it is likely we will see some changes in the battlefield in the Middle East. Well, and we may also see some changes in energy prices. But in other areas, it is unlikely that we can observe any dramatic changes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for bringing us a bit more insight. Thank you for being with us today, Evgeny.
Thank you.
And that was Eugene Yaroshenko, international relations expert at the Democracy House think tank. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to UATV.